6 months had passed since that life-changing day in Principal Davidson's office. Sarah's world had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. The quiet foster kid who once hid in the back of classrooms had become something of a local celebrity, though she was still adjusting to the attention. The investigation into Miguel Rodriguez's case had moved faster than Dr. Warren had predicted. The combination of the preserved medal, Colonel Patterson's detailed letter, and newly discovered military records had created an airtight case. The Department of Defense had officially acknowledged the historical injustice and approved the posthumous Medal of Honor for Miguel Rodriguez. Sarah sat in her bedroom at the Johnsons' house, looking at the letter that had arrived that morning. The official seal of the President of the United States gleamed from the thick paper. She had read it 5 times already, but the words still seemed impossible to believe. The President of the United States requests the honor of your presence at a ceremony to posthumously award the Medal of Honor to Private Miguel Rodriguez, United States Army, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Mrs. Johnson knocked on her door. "Sarah, honey, there's someone here to see you." Sarah looked up to find Dr. Warren standing in the doorway, holding a garment bag and smiling wider than Sarah had ever seen her. "I hope you don't mind the surprise visit," Dr. Warren said, "but I wanted to deliver this personally." She held up the garment bag. "It's your dress for the ceremony. The Defense Department wanted to make sure you had something special to wear when you accept your great-grandfather's medal." Sarah carefully unzipped the bag to reveal a beautiful navy blue dress, elegant but age-appropriate. It was the nicest piece of clothing she had ever owned. "There's more," Dr. Warren continued, pulling an envelope from her briefcase. "These are the college acceptance letters we helped you submit. 3 universities have not only accepted you but offered full scholarships under the Medal of Honor family program." Sarah's hands shook as she opened the letters. Stanford, UCLA, and the University of Texas, all schools she had only dreamed about, were offering her full rides to pursue her education. The girl who had once worried about affording community college now had her choice of prestigious universities. "I can't believe this is real," Sarah whispered. "Believe it," Dr. Warren said firmly. "You've earned this, just like Miguel earned his recognition. This is your family's moment, Sarah." The ceremony was held 3 weeks later at the Pentagon, in a grand hall filled with military officials, historians, and media representatives. Sarah had never seen so many cameras and reporters in one place. The story of the hidden medal had captured national attention, becoming a symbol of the ongoing effort to address historical injustices in military recognition. Sarah wore her navy dress and carried her great-grandfather's original medal in a small velvet pouch. She had insisted on bringing it, even though a new official medal would be presented. The original held too much family history to leave behind. As she sat in the front row between Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, Sarah thought about all the people who should have been there. Miguel Rodriguez himself, who had died never knowing his heroism would be officially recognized. Her great-grandmother, who had kept the secret safe for decades. Her grandmother Rosa, who had preserved the stories and passed them down. Her parents, who had died too young to see their daughter's moment of triumph. But in a way, Sarah felt they were all there with her. Every time she touched the velvet pouch containing Miguel's medal, she felt connected to the strength and courage that ran through her family line. The ceremony began with a military honor guard presenting the colors. A chaplain offered an invocation, and then General Patricia Hayes, the highest-ranking Hispanic woman in the Army, stepped to the podium to read Miguel's citation. Private First Class, Miguel Rodriguez distinguished himself by acts of gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty while serving with Company B, 1st Battalion, 32nd Infantry Regiment, 7th Infantry Division, in action against enemy forces near Luzon, Philippines on March 15, 1945. As the general read the details of Miguel's heroic actions, Sarah closed her eyes and tried to imagine that day in 1945. Her 19-year-old great-grandfather, far from home and family, making split-second decisions that would save the lives of 32 fellow soldiers. She wondered if he had been scared, if he had thought about the family he might never see again. The reading continued. Private Rodriguez's extraordinary heroism and selflessness above and beyond the call of duty are in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army. When the citation was complete, Sarah was called forward. Her legs felt unsteady as she approached the podium where General Hayes waited with the Medal of Honor in its presentation case. The medal gleamed under the ceremony lights, its blue ribbon pristine and new. "On behalf of the President of the United States and a grateful nation," General Hayes said in a clear, strong voice, "I present this Medal of Honor to the family of Private First Class Miguel Rodriguez, represented today by his great-granddaughter Sarah Martinez." As the general placed the medal case in Sarah's hands, the assembly rose in thunderous applause. Sarah looked out at the standing crowd, military officers, government officials, reporters, and the Johnsons, who were both wiping tears from their eyes. But what moved her most were the other families scattered throughout the audience, families of other soldiers who had finally received long-overdue recognition. Dr. Warren had explained that Miguel's case had opened doors for dozens of other investigations. Other families had come forward with their own hidden medals, their own preserved letters, their own stories of discrimination and injustice. Miguel's medal had become the first domino in a much larger effort to correct historical wrongs. When Sarah stepped to the microphone to give her acceptance speech, her voice was surprisingly steady. She had practiced this moment, but now the words came from her heart. "I accept this medal not just for my great-grandfather Miguel, but for all the soldiers whose heroism was overlooked because of their race or ethnicity. Miguel Rodriguez fought for a country that didn't always recognize his worth, but he fought anyway because he believed in the principles America stood for, even when America didn't live up to those principles for him." She paused, looking down at the medal case in her hands. "My grandmother used to tell me that the truth always finds a way to surface, even when it takes 80 years. Today proves she was right. Miguel's heroism was never forgotten by the men he saved or by the family who preserved his story. Now it will never be forgotten by history." The applause that followed seemed to echo forever. As Sarah returned to her seat, she thought about the backpack that had started it all. For years it had been her shield, protecting her most precious possessions from a world that often seemed unreliable. Now she understood that some treasures are meant to be shared, that hiding the truth serves no one. After the ceremony, Sarah was approached by dozens of people. Other Medal of Honor families welcomed her into their community. Historians asked if she would participate in a documentary about discriminated soldiers. College recruiters reminded her of the opportunities now available to her. But the conversation that meant the most came from an elderly man who waited until most of the crowd had dispersed. He walked with a cane and wore a suit decorated with military ribbons. "Miss Martinez," he said in a voice weathered by age, "I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Robert Patterson. Colonel James Patterson was my grandfather." Sarah's eyes widened. This was the grandson of the officer who had personally delivered Miguel's medal to her family. "My grandfather left detailed journals about the war," Robert Patterson continued. "He wrote extensively about Miguel Rodriguez and the injustice of his recognition being denied. He never got over his anger about what happened." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. "I'd like you to have this. It's his journal entry from the day he delivered the medal to your great-grandmother. He wrote about how proud Miguel's family was and how determined they were to preserve his legacy." Sarah accepted the journal with trembling hands. Inside, in faded ink, She could see her great-grandfather's name written multiple times, along with detailed accounts of his heroic actions. "Your great-grandfather made a lasting impression on my grandfather," Robert Patterson said. "He used to say that Miguel Rodriguez represented everything good about the American spirit: courage, sacrifice, and loyalty, even in the face of injustice." As the day ended and Sarah prepared to return home, she realized that her story was just beginning. The medal ceremony was not an ending, but a commencement. She had been accepted to Stanford with plans to study history and education, determined to ensure that stories like Miguel's would not be lost to future generations. Back in her bedroom that night, Sarah carefully placed both medals, Miguel's original and the new official one, on her dresser. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of preparing for college, for a future that had seemed impossible just months ago. She picked up her old backpack, the one that had carried her family's secret for so many years. It looked smaller now, less important than it once had. She no longer needed to carry her treasures hidden away. Miguel's story was now part of official history, preserved forever in government records and military archives. But she kept the backpack anyway. It had taught her something important about the weight of family history and the courage required to trust others with your most precious memorize. And sometimes, late at night, she would still reach for it, remembering the scared foster kid who had once hidden her greatest treasure from the world. Sarah Martinez had learned that some secrets are meant to be kept, and others are meant to be shared. The difference, she now understood, lay in knowing when the world was finally ready to hear the truth. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, drawn by the commotion, and the sight of Cadet Morrison doubled over in apparent distress. Sarah maintained her defensive posture, her eyes scanning the faces around her with the practiced efficiency of someone who had survived in hostile territory where a moment's inattention could mean death. "What's going on here?" The voice cut through the tension like a blade, carrying the unmistakable authority of senior rank. Commander James Rodriguez pushed through the circle of cadets, his weathered face taking in the scene with experienced eyes. Morrison finally managed to straighten up, his face still flushed with embarrassment and pain. "Sir," he gasped, struggling to maintain military bearing despite his obvious discomfort. "This civilian attacked me when we tried to escort her away from the restricted area." Commander Rodriguez looked from Morrison to Sarah, his expression unreadable. Sarah could see him taking in details: her posture, her uniform, the way she held herself. Unlike the cadets, Rodriguez was experienced enough to recognize what he was seeing. "Civilian?" Rodriguez asked, his tone carrying a note of skepticism. His eyes had focused on Sarah's uniform, noting details that the cadets had missed in their rush to judgment. "Yes, sir," another cadet spoke up eagerly, apparently hoping to support Morrison's version of events. "She was trying to enter the instructor housing without authorization. When we attempted to redirect her to the proper check-in location, she became violent." Sarah remained silent, allowing the cadets to complete their account. She had learned long ago that in situations like this, patience often revealed more than immediate protest. Commander Rodriguez's increasingly skeptical expression suggested he was drawing his own conclusions. "I see," Rodriguez said slowly. He walked closer to Sarah, his trained eye taking in details that spoke of extensive military experience. The way she stood suggested someone comfortable with conflict, and her uniform bore subtle signs that marked her as active duty rather than civilian personnel. "Ma'am," Rodriguez addressed Sarah directly, "would you care to provide your version of events?" Before Sarah could respond, Morrison interrupted. "Sir, with respect, we were just doing our job. Security protocol requires us to challenge unauthorized personnel, and when she refused to comply—" "Cadet Morrison," Rodriguez's voice carried a sharp edge of warning, "I don't recall asking for additional input from you." Morrison's face reddened further, but he fell silent. The other cadets shifted nervously, beginning to sense that the situation was not developing as they had expected. Sarah finally spoke, her voice calm and measured. "Commander, I'm Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, reporting for my new assignment as an instructor in advanced tactical operations. I was proceeding to my assigned quarters when these cadets challenged my presence here." The effect of her words was immediate and dramatic. Morrison's eyes widened in shock, while several of the other cadets took involuntary steps backward. Commander Rodriguez's expression shifted from skepticism to something approaching amusement. "Lieutenant Commander," Morrison's voice cracked slightly. "But we thought—" "You thought what exactly?" Sarah asked, her tone still professional but carrying an undertone that suggested the cadet should choose his next words very carefully. Commander Rodriguez stepped forward, clearly enjoying the cadet's discomfort. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying across the gathering crowd, "allow me to introduce Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, Navy SEAL, recipient of the Silver Star, Bronze Star with Combat V, and Purple Heart." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could see the cadets processing this information, their faces cycling through expressions of disbelief, embarrassment, and growing horror as they realized the magnitude of their mistake. "SEAL," one of the younger cadets whispered, the word carrying a weight that everyone present understood. The Navy SEALs were legendary within the military community, representing the absolute pinnacle of elite military training and capability. Morrison looked as if he might be sick. "Ma'am, we didn't know. Your uniform doesn't show—" "Doesn't show what?" Sarah asked. "That I'm qualified to be here? That I've earned my place through service rather than assumption?" Commander Rodriguez consulted the tablet he carried. "According to my records, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell completed Bud S training 14 years ago, making her one of the first female Navy SEALs. She's served multiple combat tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, conducted classified operations in several other theaters, and has been specifically requested for this instructor position by Admiral Hendricks himself." The cadets stood in stunned silence, the weight of their mistake settling over them like a heavy blanket. Sarah could see them struggling to reconcile their preconceptions with the reality standing before them. "Furthermore," Rodriguez continued, clearly warming to his subject, "her military record includes commendations for valor under fire, exceptional leadership in combat situations, and innovative tactical thinking that has been incorporated into current SEAL training protocols." Sarah shifted her duffel bag back onto her shoulder, the casual movement serving as a reminder of the physical confrontation that had started this entire incident. Morrison flinched visibly at the gesture. "Ma'am!" Morrison finally managed to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. This is inexcusable. We should have verified your identity before taking any action." "You should have treated me with basic respect regardless of my identity," Sarah replied. "Military bearing and professional courtesy aren't privileges reserved for those who meet your expectations." The crowd of onlookers had grown even larger, with cadets and staff members craning their necks to get a better view of the woman who had just been revealed as a decorated war hero. Sarah could hear whispered conversations as word spread through the gathering. "Is that really her?" someone whispered. "The Sarah Mitchell? I've heard stories about her missions. She single-handedly held off an entire Taliban unit in Kandahar," another voice added. "Saved her entire squad." Sarah felt a familiar discomfort with the attention and speculation. Throughout her career, she had preferred to let her actions speak rather than her reputation, but she understood that sometimes the truth needed to be made clear. Commander Rodriguez gestured toward the building that had been the source of the initial conflict. "Your quarters are ready, Lieutenant Commander. Unit 12B, second floor. Your first briefing is scheduled for 1400 hours. "Thank you, Commander," Sarah replied, her tone indicating that she considered the matter closed. As she moved toward the building entrance, the cadets parted before her like water. Their earlier confidence completely evaporated. Morrison looked as if he wanted to say something more, but Sarah's expression suggested that any further conversation would not be welcome. "Lieutenant Commander," Rodriguez called after her, his voice carrying a note of both respect and anticipation. "I believe you'll find your students here quite eager to learn." Sarah paused at the entrance, looking back at the assembled cadets. Her gaze lingered on Morrison and his companions, taking in their expressions of shame and newfound respect. "I certainly hope so, Commander," she replied, "because I have quite a lot to teach them." 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation outside the instructor housing, and the atmosphere at the Naval Academy had shifted in subtle but significant ways. Word of Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell's identity and credentials had spread throughout the institution, carried by the whispered conversations of cadets who had witnessed the incident or heard about it secondhand. Sarah had settled into her role as instructor with the same methodical precision she had applied to every mission in her military career. Her advanced tactical operations course had quickly become one of the most sought-after classes at the academy, with cadets competing for the limited available spots. The classroom where she taught was sparse and functional, its walls lined with maps, tactical diagrams, and photographs from various military operations around the world. Sarah preferred this environment to the more ornate lecture halls used by other instructors, finding that the austere setting helped focus her students' attention on the serious nature of the subject matter. On this particular morning, she stood before a class of 24 senior cadets, including several faces that had become familiar over the past weeks. Morrison sat in the front row, his posture rigidly correct and his attention unwavering. The transformation in his behavior had been dramatic and, Sarah had to admit, encouraging. "Today we're going to discuss a critical aspect of military leadership that's often overlooked in traditional training," Sarah began, her voice carrying easily through the silent classroom. "The ability to recognize and correct your own mistakes." She moved to the whiteboard and wrote a single word in clear block letters: humility. "Who can tell me why humility is essential for effective military leadership?" she asked, her gaze sweeping across the room. Several hands shot up immediately. Sarah noticed that Morrison's hand was among them, though he waited for her acknowledgement before speaking. "Yes, Cadet Morrison." Morrison stood, his voice clear and confident. "Ma'am, humility allows leaders to learn from their mistakes and adapt their strategies based on new information." "That's correct," Sarah replied. "But it goes deeper than that. Humility also affects how leaders treat their subordinates and peers. Can anyone expand on that?" A cadet in the third row raised her hand. "Ma'am, humble leaders are more likely to listen to input from others and consider different perspectives." "Excellent point, Cadet Williams. And why is that important in combat situations?" The discussion that followed was engaging and thoughtful, with cadets drawing connections between humility, effective leadership, and mission success. Sarah guided the conversation with subtle questions and observations, encouraging the students to think critically about their own attitudes and assumptions. After the formal lesson concluded, Sarah assigned the cadets a practical exercise. They would work in teams to develop a tactical plan for a hypothetical rescue mission, but with a twist. Each team would be required to identify potential flaws in their own plan and propose alternatives. As the cadets organized themselves into groups, Morrison approached Sarah's desk. His demeanor was respectful but determined, suggesting he had something important to discuss. "Ma'am, could I speak with you privately?" he asked. Sarah nodded, gathering her materials as the other cadets filed out of the classroom. When they were alone, Morrison stood at attention, his face serious. "Ma'am, I need to apologize for my behavior 3 weeks ago. Not just the initial confrontation, but my attitude and assumptions. I've been thinking about it constantly, and I realize that my actions reflected poorly not just on myself, but on everything this institution stands for. Sarah studied the young man before her, noting the sincerity in his expression and the genuine regret in his voice. What specifically have you learned from the experience, Cadet Morrison? Morrison took a deep breath before responding. Ma'am, I learned that respect isn't something that should be earned through rank or reputation. Basic human dignity should be the starting point for all interactions. I also learned that making assumptions about people based on their appearance or perceived status is not just wrong, it's dangerous. Those are important lessons, Sarah acknowledged, but I'm more interested in how you plan to apply them going forward. Ma'am, I've been reflecting on my leadership style and how I interact with my fellow cadets. I've realized that I've been operating under the assumption that leadership means having all the answers and never showing weakness. But your classes have taught me that true leadership requires acknowledging what you don't know and learning from others. Sarah leaned back in her chair, impressed by the depth of Morrison's self-reflection. What prompted this change in perspective? Morrison hesitated for a moment before answering. Honestly, ma'am, it was researching your military record, not just the commendations and achievements, but the after-action reports and interviews with soldiers who served under your command. They all mentioned the same thing, that you listened to input from everyone, regardless of rank, and that you were willing to admit when you were wrong. And what did you conclude from that information? That real strength comes from being secure enough in yourself to acknowledge your limitations and learn from others. The most effective leaders I've studied, including yourself, seem to share that quality. Sarah stood and walked to the window overlooking the academy grounds. Below, she could see cadets engaged in various training exercises, their movements reflecting the discipline and dedication that had been instilled in them since their arrival. Cadet Morrison, do you remember what you said to me that first morning? About not understanding how things work around here? Morrison's face reddened slightly. Yes, ma'am. I was completely out of line. You were wrong about my status and credentials, certainly, but you were also wrong about something more fundamental. You assumed that your understanding of how things work was complete and accurate. That kind of certainty can be dangerous in military operations. She turned back to face him, her expression thoughtful. In combat, the soldiers who survive and succeed are those who remain flexible, who can adapt to changing circumstances and who never stop learning. The moment you think you know everything is the moment you become vulnerable. Morrison nodded slowly, clearly processing her words. Ma'am, how do you maintain that balance between confidence and humility? How do you lead effectively while remaining open to new information? Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile Morrison had seen from her since their initial encounter. That's the right question to ask, and it's one you'll spend your entire career trying to answer. But I can tell you this, it starts with treating every person you encounter with respect, regardless of their apparent status or your assumptions about them. Over the following weeks, the change in Morrison's leadership style became apparent to his fellow cadets and instructors alike. He began soliciting input from junior cadets on training exercises, openly acknowledged when he didn't understand something, and demonstrated a willingness to reconsider his positions when presented with new information. More importantly, his behavior had a ripple effect throughout the academy. Other cadets began to examine their own assumptions and leadership styles, inspired by Morrison's example and by the lessons they were learning in Sarah's classes. During one particularly challenging exercise, Morrison's unit was tasked with developing a strategy for extracting civilians from a hostile urban environment. Instead of immediately asserting his own ideas, Morrison spent time listening to suggestions from every member of his team, including the most junior cadets. When they presented their plan to Sarah for evaluation, it was clear that the solution they had developed was far more sophisticated and effective than anything Morrison could have conceived on his own. The plan incorporated insights from cadets with diverse backgrounds and experiences, resulting in a comprehensive approach that addressed multiple contingencies. "Outstanding work," Sarah told the group after reviewing their presentation. "This demonstrates exactly the kind of collaborative leadership that will serve you well in your military careers." After the exercise, Morrison remained behind once again, but this time his demeanor was different. The rigid formality had been replaced by genuine respect and professional curiosity. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for the lessons you've taught us, both in the classroom and through your example. I know I still have a lot to learn, but I feel like I'm on the right path now." Sarah gathered her materials, considering her response carefully. "Cadet Morrison, the fact that you recognize you still have a lot to learn tells me that you've already learned the most important lesson of all. Never stop questioning your assumptions, never stop listening to others, and never forget that real leadership is about serving those under your command, not commanding those who serve under you." As Morrison left the classroom, Sarah reflected on the transformation she had witnessed not just in him, but in the entire culture of the academy. The incident that had begun with disrespect and assumptions had evolved into a powerful teaching moment about leadership, humility, and the importance of treating all people with dignity. The lessons learned that day would stay with these future officers throughout their careers, shaping how they led and how they treated those under their command. And perhaps most importantly, they would carry forward the understanding that true strength comes not from never being wrong, but from being willing to acknowledge mistakes and learn from them. Sarah smiled as she locked the classroom door, knowing that the next generation of military leaders would be better prepared for the challenges ahead, not because they had all the answers, but because they knew the importance of always being willing to learn.